Okay, hello, Amy.
Hello, how are you doing, Elizabeth?
I'm well. Traffic wasn't bad getting home from work today, so that
Yeah,
was that was good, especially for a nice Tuesday. But I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to do this interview. Kind of
thank you.
nervous.
No, don't be nervous. See, the day got better for us both because now we're talking to each other.
Yeah, that's so true. Very perfect. And I have to say, we're both rocking the colored hair.
Yes, I'm glad you realize this isn't natural because it isn't. So,
Okay, so first, I want to know if there is a book or podcast that you've been enjoying lately.
ooh, I have a little bit of a confession, I guess I'll put it. I love coming of age fiction. So I love like young women coming of age, turning into like big badasses with magic and fairies. Um, I,
Okay.
I'm trying to. I'm thinking about, do I explain this or just go, no, run with it? So I think I'll run with it. Um, I so so there is a series that I'm reading right now. There's an author called Melanie Karsak. Hopefully, I pronounce your name correctly, Melanie. If you're out there listening,
Yeah.
and I have always loved the stories of Boudica, who was a Celtic queen. Um, Turn of the millennium kind of thing. Ended up chasing the Romans all the way down to London and giving them a good whooping. And so I'm now reading a series. I just started book 3 of this Boudica series by Melanie Karsak. So there's magic and there's fairies and there's young women coming of age, and that's what I'm enjoying right now.
I love it. So you said number 3. How many books are in the series? Do you know?
This is the last book. Yeah, there's only 3.
Oh,
But she has there's another parallel like story to be told in the same time period of when Boudica was chasing Romans down to London. So that's of the Queen Cartimandua, who was of the Brigantes. Boudica was queen of the northern and the Greater Iceni, and there you go.
I
There's your
love it.
British history lesson for the
Yep.
day. Yeah.
I can check that off my to-do list for today.
Right, right. I figured it was probably top of the list. Make sure
Yeah,
you get some British history. Now you got it.
exactly. Okay, well, we're gonna just jump right in. So,
Cool.
first, I want you to explain why identity is critical to every human.
Sure. Identity, engaging with identity, developing and manifesting your identity is a normal human process. And we have no choice but to do this or to accept the defaults that we have around us. So I'll give an example. When I was growing up, first of all, in case, nobody was aware, I was assigned male at birth. So even though I was really socialized as a girl because I had 3 sisters and my father wasn't very present, I accepted the defaults that my society gave me. And those defaults were, you are a little boy. But it never felt right. And so I went on. And by about 12 years old, I knew I was going to transition gender. But I did not, because at 12, it was 1982. I couldn't, that's
Right.
the way it works. But I knew because I had heard from somewhere that it was possible. And so I knew someday I was going to do it. And I started looking at it when I was 31, and the time wasn't right. So at 52, I did begin doing it. And now it's been about 2 years since I began transitioning gender. And that was 52 years I did not live as the person I am. And so that brought with it a lot of pain. It brought with it choices I probably wouldn't normally have made. And so this is why I believe it's so important for us to look inside and think about who we are, because if we don't, it's a fast track to disappointment in your life. And so now what I try to do is teach people this is what you need to do so that they don't have the same disappointment. I don't want to say all the disappointment because it makes it sound like my life was horrible, which it wasn't horrible, but I certainly have more fulfillment now. That's why it's critical for each of us to engage in this process of identity. And I'm calling it a process because it doesn't end. You don't, like, at 12 years old, I was pretty aware of who I was, but I didn't do anything about it. And luckily
Right.
now at 54, I'm capable of doing something about it. And so now I'm doing it. So it's an ongoing process. It never ends. Our identity is not static. So there you
Yeah.
go.
I love it. I loved that word fulfillment that you used, right? It's like you're saying, it's not that your whole life was awful, but maybe just didn't have that piece of
Right.
fulfillment.
Right.
Yeah.
There's To go off on a slight tangent. I actually, when I began gender transition, the reason why you and I are talking actually, when I began gender transition, I realized that suddenly I could feel emotions. And this was a brand new sensation. In fact, it frightened me at first. I was going, what is this? Why am I feeling emotions? And I also felt so much calmer and so much more centered. And so I had to investigate that. I had to understand what was going on. And so my whole background is in research. So I started doing research on myself and then research on my community. And then ultimately I expanded, my sights to the human experience. And that's why you and I are talking today, because when I started gender transition, when I started engaging in the process of identity fully, it opened up so much of me and so much I didn't even expect. So
Yeah.
it was beautiful. I mean, it's still beautiful. I still look back and think, what my life was like before I really started engaging. And before I get emotional, let me just, I'll just say it was beautiful.
We'll move on from that. I do that too. I'm like, next thought. So, you brought up the term gender many times in your gender transition. So, what is gender and why should we care?
This is a somewhat long question. So
Perfect.
we the things that we're taught today, if you go to if you go to any media outlet, you will hear one of a few stories that gender is the same as sex, that gender is a social construct, or something in between. That gender is based on something physical, but it had your input into it somewhere. And I don't believe in any of those. The idea that sex and gender are identical is somewhat patently ludicrous. I mean, because you can look at human experience and say, well, we're so much more than just our physicality. We can choose our behavior. Oftentimes we can choose our emotions. So the idea that we're dictated by our genetics is foolish. I mean, I recognize that's the entire conservative rhetoric, but it's like so easily shot down. It's, I mean, there's almost not worth talking about. On the other hand, when you look at gender as a social construct, like if I were to ask you, what the hell's a social construct? Like, could you explain that off the top of your head?
No.
Whew, good. I'm glad, because I was really hoping you weren't going to go, well, yes, of course. In the 16th century, there was the philosopher Michel Foucault who brought up scientific facts as social constructs, but which is true. The point being that a word or a phrase gains meaning because it's been used in a social environment. And that's the meaning, and the concept itself get constructed by the society that uses it, the social environment that uses it. It was Judith Butler who originally applied the idea of a social construct. Like I said, it's 400 years old, but Judith Butler applied it to gender and said, people are men or people are women because society defines a concept of man and woman. I don't like that very much because it implies that gender is given to us, that we don't own it. Now, in the middle, there are a couple actually. Simone de Beauvoir's original theory from the 1960s, I believe, her feminist theory, this grew out of it. There's something in the middle where you start off with the idea of physicality, but then you look at your interactions within a social environment. And so it's kind of both, but I think it sort of suffers from both problems, that we're still more than our physicality and we're still more than the society in which we grow up. With all of this as a preamble, everybody's turning this off now. Like, oh God, that was
No,
just the preamble.
no. I'm on like
But
the edge of my seat.
oh, cool. So with that as a preamble, I have my own theory of identity and gender that that starts with the idea of an origin of identity. And this origin of identity, I don't really care where it comes from, because it could be genetics, it could be influenced by society, it could be a spirit and a soul that's out there somewhere, it could be Jung's concept of the collective unconscious. The point is, it doesn't matter. What does matter is that only you own it. So you have an origin of identity. And in that origin of identity, there's knowledge. It's knowledge you know, but you don't know why you know it. And kind of my canonical example is like if I were to ask you the question, what's your favorite vegetable? That's a hard question.
Carrots?
Carrots. No, it isn't. It's asparagus. Right?
No.
Because I can't say that, right? I mean, there's knowledge you know. If I said why carrots, you could probably get farther and farther down, but at some point you just go because,
Yeah.
because. And that's the origin of identity doing its work. There are things you know, but you don't know why. So with that origin of identity, though, we also, every one of us has to live in a social environment. And we have to interact with the people within it. We have to maintain our safety within a social environment. And so now I'm finally answering your question. Sorry, 18 minutes in. Fortunately, it was only 8. But what identity is this process of negotiation. You look at your social environment and you hit your origin of identity and say, who am I? And how can I express who I am within this social environment in such a way that I feel safe? And so there was another, it's entirely unrelated, but I heard a group of people, two people actually, who said that our identity is formed through our traumas, that our whole life is a series of micro traumas, and this is what creates our identity. I don't disagree wholeheartedly, because the traumas are us responding to our social environment and looking at our origin of identity and trying to match the two up, true the two up. So that's what identity is. Gender ends up being an external expression. I don't want to go into all the biology definitions of these. Actually, I have a presentation that I did for a nonprofit organization that details this further. The actual definitions of sex and gender from like a biologist's standpoint. But gender, so here in broad strokes.
Yes.
Sex is a species level abstraction. It has to do just with reproduction. There's nothing else that has to do with sex. It's a grouping that biologists made up based upon what you could do in reproduction. But it applies at the species level. And I'm making this point because each of us has individual genetics. We have an implementation of the human genome. We don't have the generic human genome. This is why you look like you do. This is why you have your bright red hair. And this is why I evolved to have bright purple hair. So that's what sex is. Our gender is that implementation. It's our implementation of our genetics and our cognition, our thoughts and emotions, and our behavior within our social environment. Hopefully that answered the question. Why is gender and why should we care? Here we go. Why should we care? Because again, it's part of your identity. If you don't figure this out and if you don't manifest it, you will feel unfulfilled. Your life will be less than it could be. And I want you to have the best life you can.
All
I
right.
hope that was a good answer.
Yeah, yeah. No, I love that. I think that puts out like a really good groundwork for the rest of the questions to kind of
Cool.
understand where we're at. So, kind of going off of that with identity and gender, how might you explain those or maybe just like approach them for those who kind of think it's only relevant to like the LGBTQ
Mm,
community. I think a lot of people hear the word gender or identity
right.
and they just kind of shut down because, well, that doesn't have anything to do with me. So I think you
Right.
explained it pretty well. Of obviously it's everyone, but how might you approach it?
Well, so that's why I love asking the question, what's your favorite vegetable? Because that's identity. I mean, if you have it, and I will take a guess, and maybe I'm wrong and I don't care. Maybe you're not in the rainbow. And if you're not, you still have a favorite vegetable. You still have a favorite color. You still look at certain clothes and certain looks and certain makeup or certain people, and you judge them according to knowledge you have within you, your origin of identity, as I put it. Everybody does this. It's a normal human experience, both identity and gender. Now, it so happens, being transgender, I came to different conclusions than you did. Well, actually, I came to similar conclusions that you did, but
Right, right.
expressing myself in a feminine way. But each of us has to do this. I mean, I'm sure you've met people who are tomboys. You've met people who like having short hair. You have people who will only wear long skirts, people who never wear a belt. I'm going to keep going, but I love Mary Jane's shoes. I have other people who are like, you look like you're 8. What are you doing wearing those? Just with his shoes, obviously. You can look at my face and go, you're not 8, hon. But so in any event, each of us does this. And it's not, for the most part, we're not aware of it. We're only aware of it when it bumps up against our social environment. In my case, obviously it did. I mean, it depends on where you are too. Like in Los Angeles, I grew up and is that in the 1970s there were people with crazy, mohawk hair, and I mean, it was pretty. It wasn't very. It was hard to be weird, I think, is what I'm trying to
Yeah.
say.
Hard to stand out.
Yeah. If I lived in Kansas, if I had grown up in Kansas, and I knew people with green mohawks, I think the social environment would go, what are you doing? Cut it out. Do you know where you this isn't Los Angeles,
Yeah.
would be what they'd say. So I guess when to try to pull that together at all, each of us has to do this, but it only is obvious when our social environment rejects it. And to move forward a little bit here, when our social environment rejects our attempted expression, and this is in my own this is my own formulation here. I've had people disagree with it, but when you bump up against the social environment and you say, I want to express myself this way, and the social environment goes, no, you have a couple of choices. The first is you can agree with the social environment and you go, okay, well, if that's not acceptable, I won't do it. Or it can be important to you, and you can fight back. You can say, I don't care about the social environment. Or there's the third choice, which is you can care enough about the social environment and care enough about your mode of expression that what you feel is pain, chronic pain. It's gender dysphoria. I have an example too.
Perfect.
Our son was going to, there was like a holiday program. And I don't even know where this skirt came from. Somehow our son ended up with this kind of cool sort of teal sequined mini skirt. I don't know where it came from. I kind of wish I did. Believe it or not, there was a matching handbag, which I believe the handbag we've still got. So we go to this holiday program. Our son goes in wearing the skirt. Because, I'm like, I don't care. Sure, whatever you want. In fact, honestly, at the moment, I was probably going, I'm kind of jealous
I
because
was
this was
gonna say,
before.
like, do they make that in my size or
Right. At the time, I was, I was still presenting as a man. So we go into the holiday program, and when all the kids come out, our son's not wearing the skirt. And I think, well, that's weird. So I go up after the show and I say, what happened to the skirt? And her son looks up at me and just goes, well, I walked in there and they said I'm not supposed to wear a skirt. So I said, okay. And I said, well, didn't that bother you? Goes, no, not really. I mean, if everybody else says I'm not supposed to wear a skirt, I just don't wear a skirt. What's the big deal? And I thought at the time, anyway, I thought, huh, because I never did that. I would have been, ooh, I'm not allowed to wear that? Damn. So that's part of where this idea comes from. I think probably our son walked in there and friends, said, hey, you're not supposed to wear this. And maybe briefly there was a moment of, aw, and that was gender dysphoria, but it was easily dismissed because the social environment overrode the gender dysphoria. In my case, it never happened. My social environment said, hey, you're not supposed to want the things you want. And I kept wanting them, and I still do. So that was a little bit of a tangent there, but the my point stands that my son went through this, you went through this, I went through this. We all came to different conclusions, but the conclusions are only considered strange and unusual if they don't fit in with the social environment. So, this is why I don't like social environments dictating who we are.
Okay. Sorry, you cut out for just a second. Well, I have an even more off tangent that we'll see if you have an answer or opinion on. So, kind
Ooh,
of at the end there, that all you're saying, it made me think about like we have a lot of like societal norms that are normal. When you are in a public place, you wear shoes, or you know
sure,
or random things of just like, oh, when you are in a line, you probably stand, at least a foot behind someone.
right,
So that just made me think of like we have some societal norms that are more extreme than others. And
right.
like what you were kind of saying with your son where he just went, "Oh, okay. How do we know on what things maybe we should think on a little more?" If that kind of makes sense.
It does, and it's a great question because I don't think we learn these until we do them wrong. I mean, to take your because it's kind of funny. I hate wearing shoes. And believe it or not, there is no law in the United States except for in one city in Massachusetts
Yeah.
or something like that. Vermont, maybe, I don't know, Vermont or Massachusetts, that has any legislation requiring shoes. So I don't like to wear them. So during the summer and, I'll sometimes, into the spring and fall, um, I'll just go completely barefoot and people are going, what are you doing? That's weird. But I would never have thought that it was weird until somebody said, what are you doing?
Right.
Same thing with so I mean basically the point is you have to test your expression against the social environment. Now the sad thing is that the social environment is very very contextual. So like your social environment at home with your parents, your family, that's very different from the social environment maybe you have at work or you have at school or whatever. So it changes and you have to know all of these. You have to know, hi kitty. You have to know all the social norms based on where you are. But really, the point is that you have to do it wrong first, and somebody has to disapprove it. The social environment has to reject it because otherwise, it's not a norm. It's not a social norm.
Right, right. Yeah, I like that. Those are good points. Okay, perfect. Yeah, I love that. I think that's a great story. You have really great examples to like kind of understand what you're
Thank you.
explaining. Yeah,
Yeah,
those make
thanks.
great sense. So, we kind of talked about this about how gender and identity really are an ongoing process. Um, can you maybe elaborate on what you see is important for everyone else to engage in these, like other than yourself?
Yeah, I'll go back to, the quick answer, which is that if you don't, you'll never know what fulfillment feels like. And I have another kind of canonical example. I used Kansas. You don't live in Kansas, do you, Elizabeth?
I live in Utah.
Okay, whew. Yeah, I don't know. Better or worse, I'm not sure. But I think of one of the examples, and I actually met somebody like this. There was somebody who she grew up in Kansas or Nebraska, one of the two, adjacent places. She grew up very Catholic, Christian, and conservative, and her whole life, well, not her whole life, but much of her life, she wondered if there was something else, and she never had the opportunity to find out. And at some point, there was a tragedy that caused her to go elsewhere, and then she was free to explore what else was out there. So that's one example. If you don't engage in these processes, because now my friend has, like, butch cut hair that's blue, like, which is not a typical, conservative Christian Kansas kind of look. Presumably, I don't live in Kansas,
Right.
so I don't know. But let's assume. There's another example that I got. Um, my sister, actually, I don't think she'll mind me sharing this story because she's already said I can. She and I were talking about. She and I were talking indirectly. We were talking about breast cancer, and she used the phrase. She said, "I'm so grateful for my breast cancer because it gave me the opportunity to get rid of something that was not beautiful to me." Because she grew up with very large breasts. She was always a double D, always had double D cups. And she said she always hated them. So she actually had a tragedy, cancer. Nobody wants breast cancer. But she was able to get a double mastectomy that, as the way she put it was, she said, "Now I have scars. Now they're kind of misshapen. One is higher than the other, but I love them because they're not the way they were." Because she sized down is the point. And I think that's a very powerful. It's a very powerful attitude to think that we we spend so much of our lives trying to fit into a social norm when what we could do is explore who we are and find that and be happy. I mean, it would be terrible if the only way we discover who we are is because we have these major tragedies like cancer or, whatever else. I'm sorry, I guess I don't want to tell the rest of that story there, but it's terrible to think that the only reason we might find out who we are is because something bad happened. And so that's why it's so important. And I told two stories that had nothing to do with transgender, had nothing to do with LGBTQ, had to do with just plain being human.
Right.
Because at the end of the day, I don't believe the transgender experience is different from the human experience. I had different data, I made different decisions, but it was the same process. So, yeah, I
Right.
think I'll leave it at
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Yeah. I know. I think it's really, I don't know a good word for it, maybe amusing of people who, when gender affirmation, gender affirming care, I feel like was trendy for a minute to talk about that.
Sure.
It was just amusing that all these people were like, no, you shouldn't do that, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, Do you wear makeup? Do you wear baggy clothes? Like, do
Right.
you do anything that like makes you feel good? Because that's gender affirming care.
It is an interesting factoid. Whether I'm going to throw this out here just because there is actually there was an act of Congress, and I'm trying to remember what it was called. Oh, I'm not going to come up with it. I'm sorry. I actually have it written down in my notes somewhere, but I'd have to do some searching.
That's okay.
There was an act of Congress in the 70s or 80s. I think it was like 1979 or maybe right around the turn of that decade. And that act of Congress says that no insurance is able to deny breast reconstruction for a woman who had breast cancer. Now, I don't know if you see where I'm going here, but the point is this is legislation that says that if a woman feels gender dysphoria after cancer, insurance is compelled to cover it. Now, obviously, that doesn't exist for gender affirming care.
Right.
That's a
Of course
for,
not.
right. For me, that's a bad thing. But I wrote an article without even knowing about this act. It was my sister who told me about this, by the way. Thanks, Sissy. You're
Yeah.
out there right now going, wow, I really got into this podcast. But I wrote an article because I have two friends. I have two fingers up good. Usually I end up doing something like this. I'm like,
That's
yeah, well. So I wrote an article because I have these two friends. One had a unilateral mastectomy. So she had to lose one breast. And she is very, very conscious of this. So she wears she wasn't a good candidate. It turns out, regardless of this act, she was not a good candidate for breast reconstruction. And so she couldn't get it. So she wears a prosthetic, and she has to wear a special bra with a pocket. And she's worried about this all the time. Is it straight? Is it on? She's not going to leave the house without it. And she's not, because it is a social expectation that women have two breasts. Nothing more. It's what she thinks is important. It's important to her to fulfill that social expectation that women have two breasts. Now, I have another friend who is transgender, and you typically get hormone therapy during gender transition, and so human biochemistry being as almost identical as it can be between a male and a female genome or genotype, usually transgender women will grow breasts. I mean, I did. So my friend didn't, suffice it to say. Wanted breast augmentation. Is there a difference between the first woman who had a unilateral mastectomy wanting a breast augmentation and the dysphoria she felt not being able to get one, and my transgender friend who wants breast augmentation? Is there a difference in that gender dysphoria? Because to me, it's the same. It's
yeah,
identical.
right.
Gender dysphoria is not a transgender issue. Gender dysphoria is the normal way our social environment reinforces who you're supposed to be. So I just went back to another question even. So
Yeah, I think that's just mind-boggling that you lay it out pretty simple of what's the difference here? What are we missing? Because that is pretty crazy that legislation can
it
pass a
is.
yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, it's just crazy that they can pass something like that and at the same time say no to everyone else.
And it was decades ago. I mean, it was 30, 40 years ago that this legislation was passed. Now, that being said, because most people have some people have an answer. Why is that different? People will say, well, because you're a man, she's a woman. That's the difference. And what they're referring to is your genotype, the X chromosome, the Y chromosome. But genetics, I don't know how much I want to talk about genetics, but genetics is infamously messy. I mean, there's, we like to believe that XXXY, this is a clear binary, but there are over 1,200. I don't even have that many fingers. Nobody does. What a dumb, but there are over 1,200 identified intersex characteristics. Think about that, 1,200. The estimate right now is that one in, what was it, 1 in 20? I think it was 1 in 20 births exhibit some sort of intersex characteristic. For the most part, we don't notice them because we only test genetics if there's something wrong, if there's a pathology. If you go
Right.
out, I can't seem to process something or another. They go, well, let's check your endocrine system. Oh, this is why. So 1 in 20. But this is probably not a great estimate because we just don't test everybody. If we did, it might be more, we might find it was higher. The point I'm going to make is that there are, I wish I could remember the exact number. Again, this is in my notes. There's something like 400,000 births every day. If it were only 5%, that's 80,000. No, I got that wrong. That's 8,000 births, right? I have that wrong. There's more than a million then. The point was going to be that there's hundreds of thousands of people, even just with that statistic of 5% showing intersex characteristics. There's hundreds of thousands of people per day born with intersex characteristics. This is not, something that's rare or weird. This is something that happens every day. I mean, probability is crazy, but the chances of genetics, working the way we want it to is not very high.
Yeah.
So we have tons and tons of intersex people being born. And for what it's worth, I mean, when I started transition, I responded to estrogen therapy really well. I mean, I mentioned, breast development. Usually that's a 6 to 9 month kind of affair. Like it starts going about 6 to 9 months. And I started doing it in about 2 weeks. And I reached out to my clinic. I said, what is this typical? And they go, well, no, I mean, it happens, but no, not at all typical. And we've come to take the guess now, because again, I haven't done any genetic testing, but we're making the guess that I have an intersex characteristic, like an androgen insensitivity. And if you look at my bone structure, if you look at, I was never able to grow a beard like I cared. I never had a lot of body hair. I could never grow big muscles. And it's probably because I didn't process testosterone very well. And it just so happened I found out because I got rid of my testosterone and my estrogen, and the estrogen works really well. So
Right.
anyway, big long tangent there with genetics. Hopefully
Yeah,
that
no,
didn't bore you.
I find genetics very interesting as well. It it's too much for my little brain to handle, but I find it very interesting.
It's not too much.
So, I have one final question for you to kind of wrap up everything that we've really talked about, I think. When people decide, okay, I'm going to look at my identity and or maybe like you were saying, they have a circumstance where their identity kind of bumps up against some social constructs. What's a difficulty that it's a common difficulty that people face, and how do they address it? Where do they go from there?
Right. I'm going to go to a real extreme. I have a few friends who live in Turkey. They are transgender women, and they're also sex workers, for what it's worth. In Turkey, interestingly, if you are a transgender man, so it means you were assigned female at birth and you say, hey, I want to be a man, in Turkey, they go, yeah, that's fine. They don't really care. The opposite direction, if you're a man who wants to be a woman, that's very bad. socially, men have a status orders of magnitude higher than women. So the idea of dropping that status, like they will, trying to figure out how much I want to say here. So trigger warning
Sure.
here, content warning. I mean, these friends of mine, they have seen tens, several tens of their friends killed or disappear because this is the
Wow.
life in Turkey for transgender women, especially as sex workers, because despite sex work being protected in Turkey, it's not if you're transgender. So that's kind of an extreme. You know, if you bump up against this, what can you do? I brought up that extreme example because I wanted to say, first of all, do what's going to keep you safe. There, I spoke to the guy who greenlit the movie. Of course, now it falls out of my head, and I'm going to look like a chucklehead. About Brandon Tina. Oh my gosh, why is this falling out of my head? It was a movie right around 2000. It was 1988, 1999. I'll have to look it up and tell you after the show.
Okay, please
But the
do.
point is, it's one of Hilary Swank's first films, and it was a phenomenal film. The first film I ever saw that really portrayed a transgender experience. Now, in the film, Brandon Tina is the character. Brandon is found out. So Hilary Swank was assigned female at birth, right? So she is playing a transgender man. Brandon is found out, and he's brutalized and ultimately dies. And so I will say, stay safe. Don't, the first thing I'm going to say is if there's the chance that you're going to be unsafe, don't do it. It's not worth, maybe I don't believe this, but it's probably not worth your life to be the person you are. Not if you can find some way to get away from that. So I guess that'd be my first piece of advice. If there's some way, if it's unsafe to go somewhere else, choose that. Otherwise, I mean, this is advice I've actually given to transgender women who say, "Oh my gosh, there's no way I could do this." I say, "Well, what can you do? Can you put nail polish on your toes? Can you put clear nail polish on your fingers? Anything that you can do, shave your legs. If nobody's going to see your legs, shave your legs, whatever it is. If there's something you can do, anything that's going to affirm the person you know you are, even if you're doing it on nights and weekends, even if you only get the chance to do it in private, I don't care what it is. It's important for you to do that for yourself. I know we have a society that says don't. A society says you need to do what society wants you to do. It's untrue. What that is a method of control. And I could go on long and arduously about why I think that exists, but it's a method of control. And the best thing that you can do is break out of that control.
Yeah, I love that. That's perfect and gave me the chills. I just think that's
Thank you.
great and a really great point to make and a great reminder. I think it is very controlling and sometimes it's maybe hard to notice or realize, but I
It
like the
is
idea of take the time to really think who you are, what your identity is.
right. I mean, can I have 2 minutes?
Absolutely.
Okay. What I wasn't going to say, I mean, a phrase that keeps coming up in the government is gender ideology. And this is there's no definition for it. I mean, if you look it up, there's no definition. Nobody has a clear definition of what gender ideology means. It's used by the conservatives to say, do you see how screwed up everybody who's not conservative is? And it's used by the liberals in a very, very mealy-mouthed manner, essentially to say, well, it's okay. And you go, well, what does it mean? And nobody can answer. I mean, it's stunning to me that everybody in our government wants to use this phrase, but nobody in the government has a definition, has a plan to isolate it, legislate it, whatever. It's a catchphrase that's meaningless. And I bring this up because I think that's on purpose. I think that phrase and the idea that gender ideology is something we should be afraid of or we should foster without being able to define what it is, I think it's just a smokescreen. Because if we learn that gender is something that we possess, that we own, and society has no claim on it, it will lead to us going, well, then identity is certainly something that I own. Identity doesn't. And so society as a whole starts to lose its control. Our government starts to lose its control. Because a government that has happy and fulfilled and complete people who know who they are, those people, happy, complete, and people who know who they are, they have no need for a government because they have no need to abrogate the rights of other people. And so our government is afraid of us figuring out who we are. Sounds very conspiracy theory, I know, but tell me what the gender ideology thing is. Wait, how did we even come upon this? And why is it debated on the floor of Congress when nobody has a definition? I can only think they're afraid. So that's my conspiracy theory for the day. I've just negated everything I said.
No, I love it. That's perfect. Well, I was going to ask if you had any last thoughts. So that was...
There you go.
Yeah, that was perfect. So, okay, well, I don't have any other questions. Is there anything else you want to share?
The only thing I think I would share, I mean, if what I've said has been of interest, you can go to my personal website, which is at amethysta.io. You can look up how to spell amethysta.
It'll be linked. It'll be linked in the show notes as well. So
all of my professional work is so on amethysta.io. You can follow me on social media, whatever I'm on. I also have a professional website called genderidentitytoday.com. And you can find that at genderidentitytoday.com. Yeah, there you go. It's pretty straightforward.
Perfect.
So I think that's all I'd say.
Yeah, I love it. That's great. So I end all my episodes by saying you matter and what you have to say matters. So thank you. Yeah, thank you for your time. You have been a lovely guest, and I'm going to end this recording really quick.